Welcome to another episode of Thinking Historically About. And today we are going to think historically about the relationship that trade enabled or impacted between colonists of European descent and American Indians in this kind of colonial North America time period. And my guest today to think historically about this topic with us is Dr. James Merrell, Professor of History Emeritus at Vassar College. And I've had the opportunity to kind of go back and forth with Dr. Merrell about this topic. And he's really pushed my thinking in how we can best portray and understand this era. And so I'm excited to dive into this conversation with you today. So thanks for joining us.
Thank you.
If you could, Dr. Merrell, just give us a little bit of context about your own background. So what drew you to this particular era and area of study, and why?
Well, it's a long story, but I will keep it fairly short. I kind of fell into American history initially when I was in high school, and I was in 11th grade taking American history, and my teacher was also my basketball coach, and I discovered that he had a lot nicer things to say about my history papers than he did about my basketball play. So I started thinking, well, maybe that, positive reinforcement. And then I went off to college. I grew up in Minnesota and went to a school in Wisconsin called Lawrence, a little school up near Green Bay. And there were excellent historians in the department there, one of whom in particular, Doug Greenberg, taught early American history. And he was a very exciting teacher, and I found it a very exciting field, partly because it's sort of the beginnings of things, of when you think about modern America. And so the roots of modern phenomena was appealing. And also, interestingly, the relative lack of sources for that long ago period also caught my attention. It seemed to me there was room for the imagination to have a great deal of play, not making history up, but building out from the scraps that remained. So I went on to grad school in early American history, not knowing what field I was going to go into. And all of a sudden, we were told at the beginning of our first year that we needed to come up with a major first year paper, and I needed a topic. And I went back to my notes from my college Colonial American History course and saw in there something that reminded me that Doug Greenberg had said, we don't know as much about Indians in early America as we should.
Mm-hmm.
And I thought, okay, I'm desperate for a topic. I got to come up with something for this assignment. And that led me to begin looking at Native Americans along the East Coast, and ultimately to looking at the Piscataways of Maryland and the Catawba people of modern Carolina, as well as the Hudson Valley and the Pennsylvania frontier. So it was sort of happenstance. And I've never regretted the decision, because it's a world that is both strange and fascinating to me still. I'm still trying to figure it out.
Yeah, and students, just so the scholarship that Dr. Merrell has really compiled over his career in this field at the intersection of Native American history and colonial history is really helpful when we're trying to understand this era of history. So as you engage with the resources and continue to explore his name and what comes up from it. Dr. Merrell, one thing that stood out to me in the feedback that you gave as we were refining this unit, and then in some of the resources you suggested that I explore, was the importance of language. And so, we can start with, the term Indian or American Indian. One word that you paid particular attention to was settler. And so maybe if those become kind of examples or case studies for a broader conversation around language, I'd love to hear your perspective. Why is language important when we write about the past?
Language carries great meaning in very subtle ways that can shade our interpretation before we really even started to think about it. For example, the term settler, which is very common for me. And I want to emphasize that when I began to question the way scholars today and Americans today use language, I realized that I'm among those people who has been misusing it a good portion of my life, including the term settler. Settler used just to denote Europeans who came over and their descendants here. These are the settlers, has deep implications. This is certainly what they called themselves because they thought of these lands as wild and untamed. And so
Hmm.
they're coming in to settle, to make these lands civilized. And the problem is, of course, that native peoples had been um, on this continent for millennia before Europeans showed up, and they too went into what was for them wild lands, and they too found ways to tame it. And so I'm fine with the term settler if we say Cherokee settlers or uh, Haudenosaunee settlers from the Six Nations, as well as European settlers. But the implication of just using it for colonists is that the land was unsettled before Europeans arrived. And I think that that leads to certain ideas about, well, native peoples, they just roamed the land and it was all forested and wilderness.
Sure.
And that right from the beginning, we have a European perspective and one that is very loaded against the sophistication of native peoples and native cultures.
Yeah, and I really appreciated that because the lands were settled, right? They were settled in perhaps different ways or forms than European perspectives of what a settlement looked like. But I appreciated in your book Into the American Woods, you talked about, we often think of the European perspective of going into a native settlement or community and feeling foreign, feeling like they were in the wilderness, the woods. But you pointed out that that's exactly how any native person that went into a European settlement would have felt, that this would have been wild. This would not have felt tamed.
And just the term wilderness itself, for me, coming from Minnesota, New York City is a kind of wilderness. It's
Sure.
don't know all the rules. I can't find my way around. The natives seem friendly, but you're never sure. And wilderness is in as much a state of mind, a point at which you're bewildered, as it is a state of nature. And I think that's important to recognize that Francis Jennings, a famous historian a generation earlier than mine, said Europeans did not find a wilderness in America, they made one. And I think that's a good way to put it from a native point of view.
Yeah, that was incredibly helpful. And so I think as we engage with this and other topics in the past, um, I don't think that we'll maybe ever come to a consensus on like, the perfect language. But I think what I appreciated about what you were saying and what you're saying now is just it's really important to ask the same types of like questions around historical thinking for the content that we're studying and in the way that we portray that content. So contextualizing our language, asking what are the causes behind this language, right? And comparing it to other forms of language. That's a really helpful, I think, intellectual exercise that we can do when
Yes,
we write.
I agree. And yeah, you can take this too far. You can take this to the point
Sure.
where you can't say anything about anything because you're so concerned. And you certainly don't want to go that far. But having the conversation, it seems to me, about the terms that we use, like New World, for example, or wilderness, or to talk in terms of the trading relationships that are part of this unit. Um, uh, Europeans said, "Oh yeah, well, all we had to do for the natives is trade them trinkets." Well, one person's trinket is another person's valued good, and so
Absolutely.
even so many common words can be questioned in this way, and it's the questioning and the conversation that I think is interesting and productive.
Yeah, I really appreciated that part in engaging and refining the unit. With that as a kind of our foundation, I want to dive into the question that students are engaging with. The question that they're asked to analyze is, how did trade influence the relationships between American Indians and Europeans in colonial North America? And it's a narrow focus, right? Because relationships were built on more than trade. And so students can be aware of that context, but also looking at trade in particular. And I'm just curious, when you hear that question, what comes to mind? How might you approach something like that?
Well, I have to say that I'm approaching it now within the framework, or having added the framework that your unit provides in the draft that I read, and that was, I thought, very helpful and very effective.
Sure.
But I think that trade does offer a lens through which you can view the larger course of interaction between natives and newcomers. And um, one of the best things about it was it moves us away from the very common and very real and very dark saga of European contact with native peoples in the first centuries after Columbus, and that is the massive loss of disease, the enslavement of untold thousands of native peoples, the conquest in brutal wars, the conversion, sometimes forced, of native peoples to various forms of Christianity. This is a very real story, and it's a very powerful one, and it deserves to be told. But at the same time, one of the things that I've found in my research is that these people were seeing each other as opportunities and not just as either obstacles in the case of the Europeans or as mortal threats in the case of Native Americans looking at Europeans. And trade is a way of looking at this. Both of these people, although in different ways, valued exchanging tangible items as well as trading ideas. They had been doing so in their own worlds for millennia, and when they came together, trade provided a kind of opportunity for conversation. It
Hmm.
wasn't always peaceful, it
Sure.
wasn't always nonviolent, but they wanted things from the other. It might be information, it might be knowledge, it might be a copper kettle or a beaver pelt, and figuring out a way to get there and get what they wanted forced them to listen to the other side. This is what I want from this person. What does this person want from me that'll enable me to get it? And so they developed what Richard White has called a middle ground, in which they found ways to get along. Not, as I say, always peacefully and not always happily, but they developed trade languages, as they were called, where people would speak a very basic form of a language, usually a native language, that would enable them to trade with one another. And they found a way to um, get along and to set up rules. Usually, in the early years, especially the first generation or two, rules that were largely set by native peoples, not by the Europeans coming in. And so trade enables us to see this longer term interpersonal relationship. For example, colonial traders soon learned that Native Americans in those times, and especially in Eastern North America, which I'm most familiar with, they weren't comfortable having just somebody come in and start arraying his goods in front of them and then making deals. Natives thought in terms of kinship. You were either within the
Hmm.
kinship network or you were somebody that could not be trusted. And so traders soon learned the best way to get ahead and make a profit in their terms trading was to form a relationship, a liaison with a native woman. This gave them a kinship connection. It also
Hmm.
enabled them to learn the language and customs very quickly. And so these kinds of personal relationships could be sometimes long-term and enduring. And that too is something that gets overlooked in the larger stories of conquest, it seems to me. This enabled each side to get something from the other and then to remake it. Why did Europeans want beaver pelts so much? They made them into hats. Deer skins, they took the leather and made it into various kinds of clothing. Native Americans would do similar kinds of remanufacturing of European goods. They would take a copper pot, for example, and break it into smaller pieces of copper and trade those around as ornaments, as tools, and so
Hmm.
on. Now, there's another side to trade as well. It helped to spread disease to native villages as the traders came bearing these diseases. It led to a burgeoning trade in people who were enslaved
Hmm.
by oftentimes other native peoples. It led to native becoming acquainted for the first time with European alcohol because alcohol, Europeans found, was in constant demand, and it had an elastic demand that a native who wanted to buy, say, a gun, well, would take care of that gun because it was very valuable.
Right.
But the alcohol, a native who drank a bottle of rum one day might want another one the next. So Europeans,
Right.
and they also found that we can get natives drunk and cheat them, which happened
Hmm.
frequently as well. So it had all of these bad effects, as well as natives overhunting of the animal populations and a growing dependence upon Europeans that ultimately meant that European colonial officials could issue embargoes.
Hmm.
These native peoples are not doing things that we want them to, so we're going to stop trading with them and hope to bring them to their knees. This sometimes worked, it sometimes didn't, but it's an important element of this.
In kind of your summary there, it just is very clear how complex trade is because I think as at the start, you see this very practical or utilitarian relationship. But then, as you kind of pointed out, in many native cultures, there was this kinship component to trade, which I think pretty quickly humanizes the trading process. And yeah, there's just so many layers and complexity as that builds out in a relational way. One thing that I appreciated in something I read from you is the role of middlemen, or like the go-between. You framed it in some capacities, and basically it's acknowledging that these are two very different cultures with two different languages or multiple languages, different ways of being, ways of living, cultural components of their lives. And so could you just speak a little bit about the role of this middle person in between cultures, and why that was so important?
Yeah, and I think that is another way in which it complicates even this notion of a middle ground, that the fact that there is a middle ground, and as Richard White showed in his book by that title about the Great Lakes region, it was an enduring feature of that land for a century or more, but it remains a middle. It remains a place between worlds. And this is where these go-betweens ended up being so valuable, that many of them, in fact, got their start as colonial traders, going into native villages. And then all of a sudden, when a colonial official needed somebody to talk to the local native leaders, they would call upon these traders. And so some of these traders, who were not necessarily, and usually weren't from the colonial elite, would find themselves with a considerable amount of influence and power
Hmm.
as interpreters, but in both, not just linguistic interpreters, but cultural interpreters, and explaining why, explain to a colonial official, here's why you have to sit through this long ceremony, even if you find it boring. It's important to them, and if you want to make them happy. And so this is an important feature. The challenge for these go-betweens, for these middlemen, is that neither side entirely trusts them. That one side might think that, the natives might think you're really doing the colonial leaders' bidding. And the
Yeah.
colonial leaders would say, this guy's spending too much time among those so-called Indian savages. How much can we
Hmm.
trust them? And so it's a very delicate operation, that very, very thin line that these men have to tread to please both sides without alienating either of them. And not all of their stories end up very happily.
I mean, I think of ambassadors today that kind of, you know, put themselves out on the line or on the front line in for potentially very contentious situations. And that's a very formalized position.
Yes.
And the middlemen of colonial America, both on Native and European sides, it wasn't necessarily as formal, right? It was practical, needed, right? What necessity is the mother of invention, and that's what happened.
Yeah.
At least that's what it appeared to be.
Yeah. And they're a little different from ambassadors today, who, as you say, are much more structured. These ambassadors may or may not really know the native culture and language of the country that they're going to, and they are very clearly marked as, for example, this is the ambassador from the United States of America. As you point out, in the go-betweens of colonial times, it was somewhat looser. One man might have been like Conrad Weiser, a man that I worked on, who was a German colonist, but who lived with the Mohawks for a while and was an adopted member of the Mohawk Six Nations. And he was formally recognized by the Haudenosaunee as one of them and an ambassador for them, at the same time as Philadelphia was giving him credentials. So he seemed to be wearing two hats at the same time, which of
Yeah.
course is kind of hard to manage and not very attractive, and got him
Yeah.
into some difficulties.
Okay, so this context, these relationships are complex. Despite all that complexity, and we've gone so many ways, and this is maybe not a fair question, but I'm curious, like, is there a particular primary source that stands out, a perspective that stands out from this era that you find can capture this relational component between American Indians and Europeans?
Well, the one I think of most often, especially because it relates closely to trade, is a travel account by a man named John Lawson, which was first published around 1709. And John Lawson was an Englishman who he wanted to travel. Not a lot is known about this guy, but he wanted to travel. He was thinking about going to Rome, but then he decided instead to go to South Carolina in 1700. And South Carolina had only been founded 30 years before, so it was no Rome, that's for sure. But off he went, and he, in the course of his time in the colony, he made a journey through the interior of what is now Carolina. He went through, if anybody knows where Charlotte, North Carolina is, he passed through that territory and then made his way back to the coast in what is now North Carolina. Lawson wrote about his travels, and this was all through Native Americans. He says the Indians are in charge here. These people are the ones who rule this land, even though the colonists were, settled on the coast. Natives had settled the interior long before, and they, despite disease and despite the slave trade, they were still calling the shots. He was going into the Indian countries. And Lawson, because he was a greenhorn, he was new to these lands. If he had been a go-between and he had kept a travel journal, he wouldn't have written about things that would interest us very much, because he didn't have to describe how they're dressed or their tattoos or the kinds of houses that they live in or the fact that they eat food that it was very strange to this guy just off the boat from England. Because he's a greenhorn, he writes about a lot of things
Yeah.
a veteran would not have written about. And among those things is trade. He talks a lot about the English traders who are there. He talks a lot about the natives who interact with these English traders. He talks about the goods that natives have and the way in which natives manipulate these goods, and how natives from this village only want black and white glass beads from us. Natives in the next village want blue and green beads. He doesn't know why, but it gets down to the level of granular detail, and the color of the clothing that they want and the weight of the muskets. He mentions at one point that the native people really want muskets, but once they have a musket, they want 100 musket balls to practice with until they bring the musket, and they adjust, and they shoot at targets, and they adjust, and they shoot at targets until they bring the gun to shoot according to their mind, as Lawson put it. In other words, he shows very cleverly the ways in which natives were not just taking what Europeans gave them and then trying to figure out how it worked, that they were using them and adjusting them to suit their own purposes. And it's that vividness and that color and flavor and texture of the native experience at a time when they were still in control of their world, but the trade and other elements of European culture were making inroads, that I think makes him an especially intriguing source. And it's a long book, but the parts where he talks about his experiences traveling through the native countries are not that long, so it's fairly easy to read, and it's entertaining. He tries to tell funny stories because he wanted to sell books back in London. He wanted to sell
Yeah.
copies, as any author does.
Yeah, that's a great one. I have not engaged with that book, and now it has to be added to the list. So I'm going to combine an observation that I heard with this next question. One thing that you pointed out in John Lawson's book is his going from one village to the next and recognizing that not everyone wanted the same thing. And so one of the kind of necessities of the question that students are engaging with is these two categories, right? American Indians and Europeans. But what you point out in that example is that you can't really reduce, hundreds of tribes into a singular experience. And the same can go for Europeans, come with, different goals. So with that, knowing that, for the sake of this curated research paper, you do have to reduce a little bit so that way we can answer it. But the next question I wanted to ask you is what might be another perspective that students maybe don't engage with in this unit that's worth knowing, that's something that comes to your mind, given that complexity?
That's a tough one because when you sent me the questions ahead of time, I sat down to answer them and wrote down possible answers on a sheet of paper. And I got to this one, I thought, and partly that speaks to the quality of what you're producing in terms of the range of materials that you're offering and the range of ideas. And one of them is the complexity. Another is the fact that Native Americans had been exchanging goods with each other for thousands of years before Europeans ever showed up. One element might be the spiritual character of goods to Native peoples. that Europeans, we talked about trinkets a little while ago. One of the reasons
Yeah,
that Europeans thought that natives just wanted these silly blue beads for all these valuable things was that these beads, like wampum beads, had great spiritual power to native peoples.
yeah,
They could give you access to what scholars today called other than human beings. In other words, the invisible gods and forces and spirits that rule the world and who need to be propitiated. So something like a commodity like copper, for example, would be of incredible value to the natives, not necessarily because of its utility in European terms, but because of its utility in spiritual terms. Or to take another example, hunting was a spiritual exercise for native men. They would carry out rituals before they went on the hunt, praying for a successful hunt. When they had killed an animal, they would offer thanks to the gods and to the animal for allowing itself to be killed. And this, in
right.
other words, it was embedded in a spiritual ritual that is was very real then and remains very real for Native peoples today in many cases. And that's important to see because that does tend to get overlooked by Europeans. They don't quite get it. They still think, oh, they'll just take anything we offer. These silly beads. John Smith talks about that with Powhatan. Boy, we got all of this good stuff for a few hundred blue beads, as he puts it, for
Mm,
example. And so they don't see this, but that also means that there is what you might call a despiritualization or a disenchantment, as some scholars have called it, that the trade brings in. There's a description, I don't think it's in John Lawson's book, somebody else's book from around that era and that place, where they talk about how native hunters are being driven by market forces and wanting to gather more deer skins, no longer kill the animal and follow ritual practices. They kill the animal, strip the deer
oh,
skin,
wow.
and move on, which is a very vivid image. If true,
Yeah,
if this person was not just imagining it, and there's reason to believe that he wasn't, leaves a very vivid image of a very different kind of relationship with the material world that natives were undergoing. Obviously, it was not destroyed because natives still view animals through a sacred
sure.
lens today, and view ritual as of central importance to all kinds of things in their daily and annual seasonal life. But there is something there that's important to see from the outset, that natives are seeing goods in ways that Europeans didn't quite comprehend, but in ways that are very powerful and worthy of taking notice of.
One of the so we there's students probably engage with this graphic organizer that we call Thinks within our curriculum. And one of the questions about audience is who is this written for, but then whose voice or perspective isn't here. And
Right.
really the goal is that we as historical thinkers, think about the context we can't see. And what I heard in, this spiritual component of trade is that it's important for us to not just study the seen, right? But we need to ask questions about the unseen, and that's part of being a good historian. That's part of asking these questions of context, and context isn't just in the material world, but also in like the world of ideas, spirituality, religious beliefs, and we know this today that our beliefs about the world inform our actions, quite a bit, even when we don't want to realize it or recognize it.
Yeah.
And yeah, I mean that is such a helpful, just kind of like reminder to pause, right, when we're reading these sources and
Mhm.
ask questions. What types of beliefs would inform this type of interaction? That applies here, absolutely. But I think we can take um, this goal of trying to understand the unseen too, or at least ask questions about it, really in any field of historical study.
Yeah. And if I can just offer another example of this that comes out of the wampum beads, and one of the images that you have in the unit shows a native man holding a wampum belt. And because Europeans assumed that women had no political role, they didn't tend to notice that women were often at these treaties. Men customarily in native cultures would speak at these great treaty councils, bringing hundreds of natives and hundreds of colonists together in various places, native and European towns. But they only thought the men were the important ones. But the wampum shells their value, or the wampum beads, which were belts and strings, their value to natives was central in part because who made the wampum beads? Who made the strings and the belts? It was the women of the native peoples
Yeah.
that tended to be in charge of manufacturing these. And so a man holding this belt to native ways of looking at things is saying, I'm speaking not just for the men that you see here, I'm speaking for the women who produced this belt. Or when colonists, when colonial officials would go to native villages and the women are bringing in all the food, it was like, well, they're just bringing in the food, they're cooks, and they'll clean up later. But the women supplying the food was also there testifying to, we support the conversation that is going on. But that's there, but the colonists just didn't see it. They didn't read it because of their gendered bias and blinders.
Yeah, and I mean, the lack of like communal understanding and spiritual understanding that this belt represents a community, and this community is made up of men and women, and
Right.
we are co-laborers in this trading process, even if you only see one component of it.
Yeah.
That's a once again that to me that's like a helpful question of contextualization. Why are these belts significant in the trading process? So, Dr. Merrill, you've really spent a career engaging in this research and teaching it to your college students. And I'm curious, when you have students engage, and we'll try to stay focused on trade here, and the intersection of or the relationships between American Indians and Europeans. What do you want your students to get out of it? What are you hoping for that they can walk out of that semester long course or unit within the course?
Yeah, the goals are many and various, but relating to trade, there are a number of them, and it's actually a number of them that the unit touches on. So when the students who go through this unit get to college, they'll be starting ahead of some of the students I taught.
Hey,
One
that's one
of
of
them
our
is
goals.
the famous story of Manhattan Island, in which Peter Minuit in 1625 or 1626 dupes the native people and buys all of Manhattan Island for, what was it, $24 or something like that.
Hmm.
That story is largely mythological, but it also privileges the European perspective on it
Yeah.
because it colors the entire understanding of native peoples from the 1620s onward, that these Europeans, they came in and they're crafty people and they're very smart and sophisticated and savvy, and they trick these innocent, naive native peoples out of all these valuable goods. Look, there was a fair bit of this sort of thing going on, but the recognition that natives themselves were sophisticated people who were very well versed in methods of exchange, who had their own ways of doing things, and who may have read that encounter and that exchange in completely different ways that satisfied them. To get students past this notion of Europeans got valuable goods and native people got trinkets, and to put it on
Yeah.
a more even scale is one thing that I try and do. The second one is that native peoples had, and this is part of it, they're being educated in the ways of trading with foreigners, that native peoples had been trading and exchanging goods among themselves for long before Europeans came. That too is another element that they need, that I want students to see, that native history doesn't begin when Europeans show up.
Yep.
That's why another term that we should think about is pre-contact. There's a lot of talk, including among the scholars, including among myself in my earlier years, about, well, pre-contact times. Well, native peoples have been in contact with foreigners forever. And
Yeah.
here we are saying, well, it's only when Europeans show up that the ball really gets rolling. So that's another part of this. The last thing I want them to convey is, it's hard for all of us, and this is true of me as well, to realize that native peoples who change the way that they look or the way they talk or the gods they worship are not less native somehow. There is a tendency to say, well, if you speak English and go to a Baptist church and you wear a coat and tie to an office, you're not as much of a real Indian as the Indians 400 years ago. And
Yeah.
so trade is a good way to look at this and to see that a native person who is dressed in European clothes and wearing European shoes and maybe even has a European hairstyle
Hmm.
doesn't think of himself or herself, nor are they thought by people in their community as any less native than their parents and grandparents had been. And it's this notion of native people, like any other people, are going to change. And that change, certainly there have been terrible, terrible losses over the last 500 plus years in the native world. But the notion of native resistance to those catastrophes and their resilience in the face of those catastrophes, which can include adapting in all kinds of ways, needs to be at the core of the story, as well as the losses.
Yeah, I often say that studying history, like your number one job is just to understand people from a time and place not like your own. And part of that understanding is humanizing, right? And that doesn't have to do like that's not like a moral statement. That's not mean we are agreeing with, past actors, but understanding and humanizing past actors, I think also enables us to understand and humanize people in the present, people of different cultures, belief systems, backgrounds. And that, yeah, that the reminder of of what it means to be human, what it means to be native, what it means to be American. I think we can really flesh that out more broadly in a way that
Yeah,
hopefully provides unity, right?
yeah,
And I think that's a unique maybe contribution that an authentic study of the past can provide for us even in the present.
yeah, I agree. And if I can throw out one more thing that I want my students to carry, and it kind of um, confuses them, but I call it constructive confusion. And that's two quotations. One is by a novelist named L.P. Hartley, who wrote, "The past is a foreign country. They do things differently there."
Yeah,
And I like that because, especially for colonial America, everybody there is very different from us. It's even if they spoke English and were Christian, as many Americans today are Christian, they're very different. But the other part of that, besides the past is a foreign country that do things differently, is something that William Faulkner wrote, he wrote, "The past is never dead. It isn't even past." And that conveys the way in which the past and the present are still intimately connected. And in order to understand the present and have any hope of understanding the future, you need to have a better understanding of the past. And that's an understanding that I'm still working on after all these years
sure.
doing it. That's one of the great things that I find about American history is that the more you know, the more you realize there's still more to learn, and it's even more complex and more interesting than I initially thought.
Yeah. And I mean, I think you just summarized why, those of us in this work love the work so much, right? It's never ending. It's not kind of confined to a particular viewpoint or a particular school of thought. Like it can really be, carried by the stories of people, which is never ending and always exciting. Uh, Dr. James Merrill, I so appreciate your time here, engaging in this conversation, for your feedback and strengthening of the unit that students get to engage with. And yeah, we just thank you for your time.
My pleasure. Thank you.